Welcome to A Kinder Economy. I'm Joshua Malkin and I'm from the Kindness Revolution in Leeds, and I'm with Martin Whitlock, a businessman and author of a book called Human Politics, Human Value. And today we're going to be talking about a different way of looking at the economy that is supportive of well-being. But before we do, I just want to share this definition of kindness that I came across in the dictionary, which said, kindness is a noun, an act or impulse of goodwill without self-interest or self-righteousness. But isn't the economy about rational acts that support our self-interest? What's the connection between economy and kindness as you see it?
Well, first of all, Josh, thanks very much for having me here today. Yes, the connection, I think, is that kindness is a rational act. We talk about the economy as being the acts of a rational, self-interested person, but kindness is a rational act, and in some sense is self-interested in the sense that we are all engaged in a social activity, a social life which interrelates. And so when we do good often for ourselves, we do good for others and vice versa. So I think we need to get away from the idea that the economy is about money and about business exclusively, but understand that it's about human relationships. It's about how we interrelate, and it provides tools such as money, which allow us to make those relationships work more efficiently. But fundamentally, it's about human relationships, and that's where kindness is a central component.
As I understand it, you talk about two different kinds of work and two different kinds of money. Could you explain that?
Well, the question of work, that's central to the book I wrote a few years ago, where I was trying to work out, in a sense, where has all the money gone? Why is it we're all working so hard? Why is it that there's so much wealth being created on paper in our economy, and yet many people are still badly off? There's much poverty, deprivation. Why doesn't the system work better? Where's all that money gone? So, for example, in the last 10 or 12 years since the economic crisis, the total amount of wealth in the UK has increased enormously by a factor of many trillions of pounds. But people's household incomes haven't gone up at all in real terms, allowing for inflation. So yes, it's a good question, where has all the money gone? And to understand that, we need to understand that there are two sorts of money-making work, two sorts of work and two sorts of money-making work. So rather than distinguishing between paid and unpaid work, I think we need to distinguish between productive and unproductive work, if you like, between work which has value, which produces stuff we want and need, and work which is a cost, that is to say, work that we may have to do, but it would be better if we could do as little of it as possible. And that's the central thought behind this.
Could you explain a bit more about what you mean about productive work?
Well, yes, of course. Productive work is work which does what it says on the tin. It produces things that we want and need, which improve the quality of our lives. And that therefore adds to the totality of wealth in society. So, for example, if you work in a factory making widgets, as we say, you're a widget maker and people want widgets, and the quality of their life is improved by having widgets, then you're productive by making widgets, because you're adding to the total sum of wealth in the world, or in the country, in the economy. But if you are, for example, counting those widgets, if you're counting them out of the factory door and you're counting the widget making material into the factory door, then yes, of course, in a sense, that's part of the process of making widgets, but actually it's a part that you don't technically need. The accountants probably need it, and the bookkeepers and the taxman might need it, but it doesn't actually add to the total value of the widgets that you've counted them. So that gives you a sort of picture, if you like, of productive and unproductive, even when the unproductive is still necessary. So what you want most of is widget making, and what you want least of is counting widgets, if you see what I mean. So that applies, of course, right through the economy. So it applies also to unpaid work, and it applies in all areas of our lives.
I mean, I think it's really important to develop the idea of the value of unpaid work, because at the moment the whole economy is measured by money, isn't it? And because value is absolutely delivered by people who aren't paid, whether that's at home or sometimes people are paid but not as much for caring, for example.
Well, absolutely. So whether work is paid or not is irrelevant to whether it creates value. So we mustn't distinguish between paid and unpaid. We must distinguish between productive and unproductive. And much, or majority, if not all the work that's unpaid is productive, mostly because people wouldn't do it if it wasn't. What would be the point of doing voluntary work or doing work in your family or doing work that was unpaid if you didn't want the outcome of it? You see what I mean? So in general, work in the house, whether it's housework or cooking or gardening or DIY, all those sort of things, volunteering in the community, all these things that we do which are unpaid, they all have value and they're all productive. So we need to measure them as part of our productive output. And at the moment we don't. At the moment we're only measuring work which has a financial transaction attached to it, a money value attached to it. And that is a serious problem for the way in which we're organized, because it means that we can't value, for example, acts of kindness in our economic measuring, because they don't have a money value attached, and they don't feature in the economic reckoning.
You talk about the difference between frozen and fluid money. Does that relate to the different kinds of work that you've described?
Well, it does. It's important to remember that money is a tool, effectively. It doesn't inherently have value. It's a tool which allows us to be productive and to create value in our lives, because it provides a means of exchange and it provides various other practical advantages in terms of transactions, buying and selling and that sort of thing. But it is only a tool. And so the question, where's all the money gone, is an interesting one, because, as you say, we have two different sorts of money in the economy. One is fluid, money that flows through the economy, buying and selling, and the money that people earn and they spend. And when you spend money, it goes to somebody else who earns it, and that works. That allows value to be created in the economy. And then you have frozen money, as we call it, which is money which is tied up in assets, and which you can't easily access. The only way you might be able to access is if you borrow it. And of course, when you borrow money, you effectively create an asset for the person from whom you borrow it, because what an asset is a thing that has value and an income stream attached to it. So, for example, when you take out a mortgage, you think you're buying an asset, but what you're really doing, assuming you borrowed most of the value of the house, what you're really doing is creating an asset for the person from whom you borrowed the money, because you've given them an income stream. So yes, we've got the money in the economy which is flowing and the money which is frozen, and there's far, far too much of the frozen sort of money which is not available to be used in a productive way. And that is why we had the situation I mentioned earlier, where the wealth on paper of the UK has increased by trillions of pounds in 10 years, and the average household income has not increased at all.
So are you saying that the frozen economy is a much less kind economy, and the fluid economy has more potential for kindness?
Well, the frozen economy stops good things from happening, in essence. So if you think about the asset value of a house, which is what many people are familiar with, if it's high, if the asset value of the house is high, then the rents you'll be paying will be higher than otherwise. The mortgage payments you'll be paying will be higher than otherwise. And you may think if you're buying the house rather than renting it, you may think you're gradually getting richer by doing so. But what you're really doing is making somebody else richer by handing them out, a quantity of interest every month. The amount of money you will pay on interest over a 25-year mortgage will be very, very surprising to you if you add it all up. So, yes, it's an opportunity lost that we have so much money tied up in assets to do beneficial things in our lives which help people, many of which could be unpaid and many of which could be motivated by the sort of motivations of kindness and neighborliness and goodwill that we are all familiar with in our family and community lives, but for which we have maybe too little time and too little energy because we're so busy on the rat race, running around the wheel, trying to generate the money to pay our mortgages and to pay these enormously expensive assets that we're involved in.
So it sounds to me as though the image of the economy that you've given to me is that we're on a hamster wheel, working very hard to turn the wheel, but the value that we're getting out of it is very limited because the frozen part of the economy is sucking out a lot of the capital away from the things that we want to actually create that improves the quality of our lives. I don't know whether that's a good analogy, but I'd like to go on to the idea of how we measure value, because it seems to me that how we measure value is hugely important in the results that we get.
Well, you get what you measure fundamentally in so many situations, certainly in a policy situation. I mean, you see that, for example, in education, where the framework of education success is so focused on exam results, whether that's SATs exams or whether it's GCSEs or A levels or whatever, that the people providing the education, the teachers in the schools, are forced to really focus on getting those results to be as good as possible, irrespective of whether that's in the best interest of children and whether that produces the best educational outcome. So, yes, you get what you measure, and if you only measure GCSEs, that's what you get in the school. And similarly, in the economy more widely, if you only measure money transactions, as we do at present, then the government and policy is all driven towards making those transactions as big as possible. So in that context, high house prices and high asset values are really helpful because they increase the amount of money in the economy, even though it's not money that can be used in a useful way. But also, they make it they give people less time, if you like. If you're prioritizing making money, and if the government is encouraging people to prioritize making money in their lives, then they have less time and energy for creating wealth in ways that don't involve money. And those are the sort of ways that, generally speaking, as I say, involve relationships and kindness. So to cut to your question, we would be much better off if we had a way of measuring the activity in the economy, which, as I say, is all about relationships, measuring the activity between people in terms of the benefit they gain from it, rather than in terms of the amount of money that is made out of it.
And that also applies to the environment, doesn't it?
Well, the environment is completely, pardon the phrase, completely stuffed by this method of measuring the economy. Because if you take a rainforest, for example, a rainforest which clearly is really important to the health and benefit of the planet has no value in the economy until you cut it down, turn it into logs or furniture or whatever. So there is nothing in our economic balance sheet, if you like, which says that the rainforest is a good thing and should be valued. But there is something which says that if we cut it down and turn it into logs and sell it, then it is valuable. And the same would be true of, for example, an oil spill. If you spill oil off the coast and you have to have a very expensive operation to clear it up, then the operation generates financial activity, and that is a plus to the economy. Whereas you might have thought that not having the oil spill in the first place would have been a greater benefit. So there are so many ways in which we allow the economy to be degraded because we're not valuing its inherent benefit that we get from it from a healthy economy. So the quality of the air would be another example. In fact, wherever you look, you find the environment is impacted by activity which is harmful, but which generates a money transaction. And as a consequence, we're prioritizing those money transactions over the care and health of the environment.
So in terms of policy outcomes, this different way of looking at the economy can create much kinder outcomes that are more beneficial, that create more value. I wonder if there are other policy areas that you'd like to just mention as well.
Well, there's a huge range of policy areas in which, well, I think the first thing to say perhaps is that policy is crucial to this. We make decisions which really have an effect upon how we live our lives, and people forget that sometimes. They forget that the economy is not a given. It's not a system which is set in stone some thousands of years ago, and we just have to put up with it. The way the economy is structured, whether it prioritizes money or whether it prioritizes kindness or whether it prioritizes the environment or whatever it prioritizes, that is a consequence of a series of political decisions taken by governments over the years. So it's important to understand, therefore, that we can change the way in which we organize our economy. So if we wanted to prioritize kindness in the economy, if a kinder economy was our objective, we can make the rules do that for us. It's perfectly possible. So to give practical examples, I mean, if you take a number of policies which have been mooted in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, one that's particularly topical at the moment is the universal basic income, which I'm sure you've come across. The idea that everybody should receive, instead of having benefits unpaid to people who are in particularly difficult situations, unemployed or whatever, everybody should receive an income which is just about sufficient to live on, and they can then use the time that they have to work productively in whichever way is most productive for them and their family and community, which may be paid work producing stuff, or it may be working in their family or in their community. It creates opportunity to do productive work. So that's one idea which I think has real merit. And just to give you an example of how that would work, if you want to set up as a cabinet maker, for example, then you need money to do that. You can't do it without materials, you can't do it without tools, you can't do it without premises. And I think that the great benefit of something like the universal basic income would be that you would have at least access to enough to get going without having to go to a bank and make a business case that they probably wouldn't recognize. And the first thing they'd say is, well, how are you going to guarantee this loan that we're going to make you to start your business, and all the rest of it? Because the bank is only seeing the outcome of your business in terms of the money you're going to produce. Whereas realistically, we should be looking at that in terms of the livelihood you're going to produce for yourself, which is not purely a money thing. And also the quality of the product you're going to produce at the end of it. So that's one rather long-winded example.
That brings me to social enterprise, because there are huge numbers of people setting up cooperatives or setting up community interest companies and social enterprises. Now, you're a businessman. How do you create kindness in your business, and is that going to make the difference that we need to see, the scale of change that we need to see?
Well, I think that's also a very important question. There is a lot of work going on at the moment around social enterprise, which is businesses which are not primarily designed to make a profit. They're designed to ensure that all participants, customers, employees, suppliers, everybody, all the stakeholders in the business, if you like, are well treated and designed to produce social advantages, social goods as a consequence of the business. There are a number of models of social enterprise. I think that from my personal point of view as a businessman, in a very conventional business, in the retail industry, with the shareholders to whom I'm answerable, it's tricky. We have done our best, we have tried to run our business in as ethical a way as possible. We pay the real living wage to our staff, and we try to make sure that they're well treated. But at the end of the day, we are playing by the rules that are currently in place. Now, I totally admire people who change the rules for themselves, and they go out and they run their businesses, or they do their activity in a way which is entirely focused on benefiting the community and benefiting others rather than just making money for themselves. I admire that enormously, but it's very tricky to do that if you are operating within the current framing of, as I say, of shareholders and bank loans and all those sorts of things that we've got to deal with. So what I would say is that if the rules were different, it would be much, much easier for businesses to behave differently, because then everybody would be working in the same way. So, for example, a social enterprise who wants to compete for a government contract is going to be already at a disadvantage because it doesn't have access to the money, the capital that it needs to set up the activity which the government is wanting them to do. So if you take, test and trace, for example, which is currently going on because of the COVID crisis, that's a contract established by the government, which has gone to well-established profit-making companies to run the system because they've got the resources, they've got the people, they've got the money, they can set it up and they can go with it, and they can make a profit out of it. If a social enterprise wanted to do that, it'd be really difficult because they wouldn't have access to those resources. So by changing the rules, by making the resources equally accessible to everybody, then you can have a big impact on the way business operates.
I'd like to just perhaps finish off by talking about an issue which is quite dear to my heart, which is housing. Lots of young people can't afford housing these days, and I think you gave an example of how the rules have been changed from the 1950s that has contributed to that housing shortage. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Okay, so if we go back to actually the 1920s, to just after the First World War, the rules were changed so that local authorities could buy land at agricultural values and build social housing, which is why we had so many excellent council houses built in the 1930s. And that continued right through to the late 1950s, where also in the post-war period, post-Second World War period, an awful lot of good social housing was also built. And then in the late 50s, the rules were changed back so that the value of any land would belong to the landowner, and the benefit could not be put straight into social housing. And since then, we've seen house prices rising and land values rising. So now we have a situation where if you buy a house, say you spend, say, £200,000, then probably it varies, but maybe typically £80,000 of that is buying you the house, and £120,000 of that is buying you the land. And that doesn't seem like a sustainable situation going forward. I mean, you can just about build a house for £80,000. It's a stretch, but it would be a small house, but you can just about do it. But how much better that house would be, and how much better would the quality of the life of people living in that house be, if the house could be built for, say, 120 or 130 or 140,000 pounds? It'd be a bigger house, it'd be a nicer house. I'd have a bigger garden, various other things, and the land value be far less. And that's just a matter of policy. It's because we have a planning framework in place which makes housing land very expensive, and the value of that land all going to the landowner. And we can change that. That's simply a matter of changing the rules. And for some reason, governments historically have been very, very reluctant to do that. But if we were to change the rules, we could make housing much less expensive. And that would benefit, strangely enough, even people who already own houses. And that's strange, as I say, but the reason is that most money that goes into housing, in Britain at least, stays in housing. So parents who buy a house and they want to help their parents, they want to help their children buy houses the next generation, they will often use the value of their house in some way to raise money to help their children buy a house. Now, if you think about that transaction, if the parents' house is hugely valuable, that means that the children's house is going to be hugely expensive, albeit less expensive because they're smaller. But if the children obviously are having to raise mortgages to top up the money the parents are lending them in most situations. So if you could reduce the value on both sides of this, so the parents' house might be worth a lot less, but then the houses the children wanted to buy would be also much less expensive, then the amount of additional money they need to borrow would also be much less. So their everyday income would be significantly greater. So paradoxically, by reducing the value of housing for the people who own the house, namely the parents, you're actually helping the entire family significantly. And that's something which is quite hard to get your head around. But if you can get your head around, you can see that there is really no downside to reducing house prices over a period of time, provided it can be managed effectively.
And that would give access to lots of people to the first rung of the housing ladder who currently can't afford housing.
Well, it would reduce rents as well significantly. And of course, the people who lose out would be the people who've invested in housing as purely as an investment.
Yes.
The people who've got lots of houses, and that's inevitable if we want a society which is in which money is more usefully distributed towards people who can make use of it rather than stored away in these frozen assets. As I say, that's an inevitable consequence.
So the conclusion I'm taking away from this is that if we want a kinder economy, we need kinder rules. And kinder rules can only be made probably by governments. But if we understand that there are different kinds of work, different kinds of money, and that value is not in money alone, then we can lobby our MPs to create kinder rules. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, of course, it's absolutely crucial, as I said earlier, to understand that this is political. This is not. None of this is cast in stone. If we want rules that prioritise kindness, then we can have them. It's not difficult. It's easy enough to think of what those rules would be. The economy is simply a set of rules which govern the way in which we relate to one another in terms of if you like, material relationships. And we can change those rules. Of course we can. And the people who have the power to change those rules are the people in government. And I mean, just to make a controversial point, if I may, we shouldn't be talking too much about sort of everyday politics in a conversation about kindness, perhaps. But it's interesting to note that one of the consequences of leaving the European Union is that we're even freer to change our rules than we were before. Because some people might take issue with this, but people have said quite rightly that if you're not bound by the rules of the European Union, you've got more flexibility. It's an odd one, that, but funnily enough, we're better placed now than we have been for a long time to change the rules. We don't have to change the rules to make Britain a huge international trader, much more focused on trade with China or South America or indeed North America or whatever. We could change the rules to make Britain much more focused on trading locally, on building resilient local economies, on prioritising kindness and relationships in our economic structures. We can do all that. And as you rightly say, the first step is write to your MP, so to speak.
Okay. So those are a few thoughts on how we can create a kinder economy. And if you're interested in joining the Kindness Revolution, please look at our website, kinderleads.org, and have a look at the other Catalyst events for a kinder world. Thank you, Martin.
Well, thank you very much, Josh. It's been very interesting talking to you.